For the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, I'm David Hood, and this is Deadline, DBN's monthly news program. Dateline, August 2020. For our top story, there is one diplomacy variant which has been played in our hobby almost as long as the basic game itself, Gunboat. Playing a game of diplomacy in which the players do not actually engage in any diplomacy seems like a contradiction in terms. Nevertheless, since the 1970s, hobbyists have been playing individual gunboat diplomacy games, both face-to-face and remotely, as well as playing in gunboat tournaments, from the 7x7 round-robin tournaments of the play-by-mail period to the recently begun first-ever gunboat tournament on Nexus. What makes gunboat so popular? Should your strategy or tactics be different when you play these anonymous games without the negotiation that gives classic diplomacy its unique charm? Later in the newscast, we'll talk to hobby veteran Melinda Holley about how Gunboat was played in the past. And then we'll have a roundtable discussion on all aspects of current gunboat play, both operational and strategic. But first, a look at headlines from around the world of diplomacy. Tommy Anderson from the Boston area captured the 2020 Liberty Cup, Philadelphia's diplomacy tournament held virtually this year. Coming in second was Natty Schaefer, while John Anderson finished in third. Interestingly, both hail from the state of Utah. 76 players from Europe, Australia, Asia, and North America competed in this August 1st two-round event. Here's Tommy Anderson describing his first big tournament win.
You took your shot.
Why not?
And you won. What does this portend for the future for you for diplomacy?
I'm just excited to keep playing. I mean, this was kind of a turning point for me in the sense that I've been kind of frustrated where I've just been middle of the pack. We had I felt like I've done like decent tactics in certain games, like face to face, or especially like I've done a lot better on Gunboat than I have face to face. And I think I kind of mentioned you earlier, like one of the things that I've really taken away from these back-to-back virtual face-to-face tournaments is learning to communicate more and try to get a pulse on what everyone's thinking. And I think I improved a lot, both with like my tactics standpoint as well as just the diplomacy aspect and knowing when to only like stab at the appropriate moments and like when there's more for me to gain than there is for me to lose. And I just want to try to keep my main thing is now I'm trying to really spend more time doubling down, trying to really analyze my games, not just play like passively, having for fun. And just like you said, just being happy to be part of the game, trying to actually like study it more and figure out, you know, how can I continue to just do well consistently going forward. And obviously you're not going to win all, or like, you know, you're going to have bad tournaments, but this was just, it was gratifying for me and surprising too in certain ways, but it was gratifying just to actually finally, like after playing for a couple of years, actually have like a good result.
DBN coverage of the Liberty Cup, including a wrap-up show and videos of each round and individual game, is available to view on our YouTube and Twitch channels and can be accessed at diplobn.com. A virtual diplomacy league has begun play under the leadership of Zachary Moore from the Minnesota Diplomacy Club. Virtual face-to-face games are the newest rage in diplomacy, combining the thrill of immediate vocal negotiation between players on 15-minute deadlines with the convenience of playing in such a format without the time and expense of traveling to tournaments or house games. Moore will be hosting 1 or 2 virtual game days per month and has league standings calculated using completed virtual face-to-face games to date. League play for the current VDL Season 1 will culminate in a league championship game to take place in January 2021. 2 rounds of VDL games will be played on August 15th, so to find out how you can participate, check out the VDL Discord server listed below this newscast. The Diplomacy Broadcast Network has announced plans to stage an invitational tournament in February of 2021. Winners of face-to-face tournaments in 2020 will automatically qualify, as well as winners of selected extended deadline tournaments. The field will be rounded out with players ranked according to their performance in those competitions. The Invitational will be played over 3 weekends, culminating in a top board for the championship. More details can be found on DBN's website. The popular diplomacy site Backstabber has implemented several changes in recent weeks, both responding to user suggestions and also helping to better host virtual face-to-face play on its platform. Games played now with 15-minute deadlines have 3-minute grace periods to better facilitate tournament play. In addition, the grace periods are sudden death, allowing for the adjudication to happen immediately upon submission of all the orders. Perhaps the most remarkable change was the optional addition of country color-coded background shading for all supply centers owned by each power. The Swiss Diplomacy Championship will be played in person on September 5th and 6th in the southwestern Swiss city of Sion. The event will also double as the 2020 European Diplomacy Championship. Organizer Pierre-Yves Franzetti has planned for 3 rounds over the 2 days. For more information, look for the Facebook page link in the description field below this broadcast. On July 26th, the Weasel Royale was played to determine the 2019 season champ for the Windy City Weasels, the Chicago Diplomacy Club, which is one of the most active in the world. Corey Neslin took her first championship by topping the board as Italy in a game which featured a reasonably strong AI, near constant RT warfare, and a rogue French fleet whose home country was lost, but was still able to visit first St. Petersburg and finally Edinburgh by game's end. Follow Corey's successful domination of her fellow Weasels by watching the recorded live stream commentary available right here on the Diplomacy Broadcast Network. Season 5 of Full Press Online play on the Nexus Discord server has already begun, with registration open through September 16th. Games will be scored using the tribute system, with the finals set for November. The primary goal of Nexus is to facilitate interaction between the hobby's online communities, so players can use web diplomacy, play diplomacy, duplicity, backstabber, conspiracy, dip bounced, or V diplomacy during the preliminary rounds. Go sign up to play now on the Nexus Discord server. The Australian hobby will be hosting its inaugural virtual tournament on the first weekend of December. There will be 3 rounds. The first in New Zealand morning time, designed to be reasonable for North American players. The second in Melbourne time, and the third in Bangkok time, which should be doable for the European players. More details, including how to register for this Rumble Down Under, will be provided in next month's edition of Deadline News. Legendary Tactics recently released 2 new videos centered around the game of diplomacy. In one, the host Randy Thompson shows and describes the moves in a game on Backstabber, in which his Russia was stabbed and eventually overrun by a Turkish player in his first diplomacy game ever, after Randy refrained from eliminating the Turk when he owned only Smyrna. In the newest release, Randy discusses his experiences playing in the Liberty Cup and explains some of the mechanics and etiquette involved in virtual face-to-face tournament play. You can find these 2 videos on the Legendary Tactics YouTube channel. This year's World Championship, the World DipCon, was to be held in conjunction with DipCon, the North American Championship, at the host site of Carnage in Vermont. Due to coronavirus restrictions, Carnage will now be hosting the 2021 World DipCon instead, with Bangkok, Thailand scheduled now to be hosting the World DipCon in 2022. This year's Carnage will be a 3-round event played virtually on November 6th and 7th. Other upcoming events in the virtual face-to-face circuit include Chicago's Weasel Moot, to be held on successive Saturdays, August 29th and September 5th, with a top board on Sunday, September 6th, as well as the DC area's Tempest, to be held virtually on Saturday, October 17th. DBN will, of course, cover all these events live right here on this channel. For more information on these upcoming virtual tournaments, please consult the description field below this broadcast. Turning to our feature story for this edition of Deadline, Gunboat Diplomacy is extremely popular in today's hobby, with Nexus running its first gunboat tournament for online players, and with the face-to-face community playing hundreds of games organized through their space on WebEx Teams. Gunboat popularity is hardly new, however. Since at least the 1970s, Gunboat was a staple in the postal hobby, as well as at face-to-face events, where it was run with 7 silent players sitting together passing notes to the GM for orders, written on identical sheets of paper to maintain power confidentiality. Hobby veteran Melinda Holley was particularly important to the history of Gunboat in the diplomacy hobby, as she ran numerous 7x7 round-robin tournaments in her diplomacy zine Starwood, and played in scores of Gunboat games herself. Let's walk down Gunboat memory lane with Melinda. Melinda, welcome to Deadline.
Thank
DBN
you.
viewers know you mostly from your participation in the virtual tournaments this summer, but your involvement in the hobby goes back decades. When did you first start playing diplomacy, and what brought you to the game?
I don't remember the exact year, but it was the late 1980s. Most of the people at the time, it was just the postal hobby. And most of the females, women, girls came in through their husbands, boyfriends, brothers, significant others. I came in differently. I had been playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons for years. But our group was splitting up. People were going different ways. Their lives were changing, all that. So I was looking for something else to play. And someone recommended Diplomacy. Had played it years before. I started checking to see what, zines were out there. I just picked one of them out of the hat, so to speak. Signed up for a game, and then thought, I need to actually get the game to know how to play it, because I did not know. So went down to the local hobby store, got the game, read the guidebook, read the rule book, and my first game was as Russia. Fortunately, the Italian player was Kathy Caruso, and she mentored me into the nuances of the game, and really, with her help and guidance, I started really playing. Had I not had that, I probably wouldn't have stayed with the hobby, because I was horrible in that first game.
Well, most people are horrible in their first game. Kathy Caruso is a name that folks probably don't know these days, but was a very important hobby figure in the 80s in particular.
Oh, yeah.
And she was a editor of Diplomacy World for a while. And was not only known as one of the better one of the better players in the hobby and hobby organizers. So it's great to have her as a mentor.
Yeah, I like I said, I probably would not have stayed with the game, because I would have been disappointed. I mean, if something's not fun, you generally don't tend to stick with it.
Well, one thing that you stuck with and you were particularly known for in the 80s and the 90s was for GMing what were called 7x7 round-robin gunboat tournaments. Tell us a little bit about what that was.
You played 7 games simultaneously as a different country in each game. So you would be playing all 7 countries in 7 different games at the same time. There weren't a lot of people that wanted to play that many games simultaneously. So it never really took off, but they were a lot of fun, because you were up against the same 7 people. You just didn't know where they were sitting on the board in each game.
Well, I think you're not giving yourself enough credit here, because I do remember them sort of taking off. There was an article you wrote, I think in 1995, the cover story for Diplomacy, which you analyzed 84 different gunboat games. So that must have been, I guess, 12 of these 7x7 tournaments. So there were at least some people, and I remember playing in a few of them myself. Some of us were nutty enough to do that. As I recall the article, France did the best overall. followed by Turkey and then Austria, while Italy did the worst.
Yeah.
What is your current thinking on the relative strengths of the great powers in gunboat, considering that you've run so many gunboat games in your career?
France is a strong country to start out with. And I think that's its strength and advantage. England and Turkey, they're the corner pieces. As long as they don't get flanked, they can hold out quite a bit. England has the advantage and strength of building fleets quickly. So can almost set up a shield wall to protect the homeland and then start expanding. And if Turkey ever gets out of the corner, that's a hard nut to crack to take them out. Germany and Austria especially, is considered a hard country to play. I see them as having a lot of opportunities that the other powers don't have. They sit right smack dab on the board, and they can influence almost every aspect of the board, either positively or negatively. They have so many ways they can go. They also have, can have three powers coming after them at the same time. But I think their strength lies in the options they have. They don't have to commit to a certain strategy right off the bat. They can afford to be a little patient. Russia, I guess because it was the first country I played, I've always had a soft spot for Russia. Russia needs the patience. The whole thing, generally, at least at this point in time, seems to be you don't want Russia to get 6 centers in 01. So Russia has to be very patient, has to do a lot of strategizing. And if you play a lot of gunboat, I think it improves your ability to figure strategy and tactics a little better, because you're not distracted by negotiations. You play the board. Italy, God love that little country. Italy is a country that almost has to commit one way or the other right out the board. Spring 01, you don't have a whole lot of options to move. And when you do move, it signals your strategy. So I think that's why Italy didn't work out too well in this analysis that I did.
Well, as we say in the South, the Italians, bless their hearts.
Yeah.
Well, let me say that, Melinda, you are one of the trailblazing female players in the world of diplomacy, actually. What are your thoughts on the history of gender inclusivity in the hobby and how we can improve in that regard?
Well, I never considered myself a trailblazer. That's very flattering. Thank you. As I said before, when I came into the postal hobby, most were there because of, boyfriends, husbands, brothers, whatever. I don't think that's the case today. There weren't many women playing when I first joined. I don't have any statistics to back this next statement up, but I think there are more women playing now. And playing because, while they may have come in through an association, I think a lot of them have come in because they've heard about the game, through friends or whatever. Gaming in general, I think, has always been perceived as being for the guys and not the girls. Whether it's, Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, whatever. I think that's how it was marketed and focused. I think we need to change that. I think we need to put our focus on letting people understand this is a thinking game. You have to think in this game. I liken it to the TV show Survivor. Outwit, outlast, outplay. You have to do a social game to negotiate. If it's gunboat, you don't. You play the board. But you still have to outwit, outlast, outplay. I think if we market that as rather than your quote unquote war game type of opportunity, I think we get more women in.
Well, Melinda, any final thoughts for our viewers particularly about Gunboat, but also about the play of diplomacy in general, from a hobby veteran such as yourself?
I think, especially perhaps new players, should play Gunboat maybe a little bit more often than they play regular, because you do sharpen your skills of strategy, tactics, and reading the board. I know that it's helped me do that for however much good it's done. I think there's an advantage and a strength to playing Gunboat that will help you in a regular game and even in a tournament, by just being able to read the board and, well, if it was me, what would I be doing if I was France facing an EG attack? But looking at how pieces are set on the board. I think this hobby of ours has a lot of room for growth. We're always looking at the next generation to bring in new, younger players to carry on. I think in the virtual world, social media is going to be a big part of gaining that growth.
That's great, Melinda. And so thank you so much for being on our program.
Oh,
and we look forward to seeing you in more virtual tournaments going forward.
I'll see you in Chicago.
To discuss both the theory and practice of Gunboat in the current diplomacy hobby, I've invited to the show a panel of experts. Joining us today are Davide Chignoli from Italy, known online as Pez de Mer, one of the organizers of the Nexus Discord server, Brother Board, a prolific online diplomacy author in Atlanta, Georgia, who has written numerous pieces on gunboat strategy, and Riaz Varani, a frequent gunboat player from British Columbia. Brother Board, let me start with you. How should players new to Gunboat approach the game differently from they would a game of classic diplomacy?
There are a couple of core differences between Gunboat Diplomacy and press diplomacy or classic diplomacy, even though the board and the pieces and the countries are all exactly the same. The most important difference is that the metagame is very different. And by that, I mean the expectations of the players and what is a good strategy that they might employ. The inability of the players to coordinate their moves with words means that certain strategies and tactics from classic diplomacy, those are off the table. And it also warps the balance of power. So wise players account for this in how they play. The communication being limited means that you have to learn the subtle art of communicating through moves, both in terms of sending messages to other players and understanding the messages the other players are trying to send you. And finally, there's the skill of predicting the other player's precise moves that is always present in diplomacy, but is much more important in gunboat diplomacy because you can't tell the other players what your moves are going to be, and they can't tell you either. This means that you have to guess what your ally is going to choose for their moves if you're going to support them and vice versa. And it also means that you can't trick a player into moving into positions with words. You have to predict and counter their precise moves.
Interesting. Pez, why did the Nexus community start up its first gunboat tournament recently, and what lessons have you learned from running that event?
Yes, we are currently doing our first gunboat tournament. The lessons are linked to the differences between gunboat and full press events. And our mistakes were to organize a gunboat event like it was a full press. The main problem is that a full press event is very demanding for players. So you cannot make people play too many games, while a gunboat event is not demanding at the same level. So the major issues we had were linked to the fact that our tournament was a first phase with 2 games and then the finals. And we discovered that people was ready to play at least the double of the games. So we had the problems among the players were about nations whose results were very difficult. We had France and Germany. We did very well. So who picked France and Germany had a big advantage. We had problems with unreliable players or with low quality players. So we had that in the first phase, it was very lucky to find a player that was not so good to solo. And we are almost at the end of first phase, and all finalists will be soloist, but one. So we have experienced it, and in the organizing the second trophy that will be next year, we will surely make a 4-game first phase and maybe a second phase before the finals.
Riaz, you're primarily come from the face-to-face world. So face-to-face players have organized hundreds of online gunboat games in the last couple of years. What explains the popularity of online gunboat within the face-to-face community, do you think?
That's a great question, David. There are several reasons. One specifically is it's a great way to sharpen your tactics. We can't be at face-to-face events all the time, especially these days with COVID. So it's really a great way that you can sharpen your tactics. Additionally, it's relatively relaxed. Unless you're playing a speedboat game, if you're playing a regular gunboat game, you input orders once or twice a day. There's no major pressure. Win or lose, it's not a big deal. That also allows you to play multiple games at the same time. On top of that, because of the freedom and the relaxation and the easygoing nature, you can try different openings that you wouldn't normally try in a face-to-face tournament, and different alliances. For example, Italy and Turkey. How many times does that happen in a face-to-face tournament? And it's also really a great way to stay connected with the diplomacy community. For example, I've always had a good relationship with people like you, David, and it's a great way for me to be able to play games with you and to learn. And another nice thing is the anonymity. And what that allows is for a really highly skilled face-to-face player, sometimes they get targeted quite often. So this is a great way for them to be able to do whatever they like with no one being able to identify them right away.
Well, I listened to part of that, Riaz, but I had a hard time getting past your comment of win or lose. It doesn't matter very much because that's not the Riaz I know. But at any rate, Brother Board, what do you think the biggest mistake that people make when they're playing diplomacy, playing gunboat diplomacy specifically?
I think that the most common and most serious mistake for gunboat players is they choose a line of play that makes it unlikely or even impossible for them to ever get a solo win just based on how the metagame of gunboat diplomacy plays out. Because the players are not able to secure their flanks with press, they're paranoid and skeptical about their neighbors, and they should be. Stealing dots from people is really common in gunboat diplomacy. However, this can lead players to an overly conservative style of play where they advance only very slowly, reluctantly, and meanwhile another player who made some bolder choices pulls ahead earlier and is more likely to be able to solo win. And I think that that this lack of risk taking means that you're likely to end up in a draw at the end.
Riaz, what do you think about that? Is that what happens in your experience, or do you see any other particular types of good or bad moves in gunboat versus regular diplomacy?
I do see some. I've been playing quite frequently, and I've noticed quite a few. One of the first is face-to-facers tend to treat gunboats just as a regular diplomacy game. But as Brother Board mentioned, it's so different. It's a very different type of game. It's like saying I want to watch football and saying I want to watch the Arena League or I want to watch the NFL, and it's the same thing. it's really not. It's a completely different game. There are elements that are common, but it's very different. There are some other ones. For example, new gunboaters will get paralyzed because they think there's no way to communicate. Additionally, in gunboat, your tactical mistakes, they really get magnified because there's nobody you can ask for help, and there's nobody coming to help without large signals. So it's really a focus on tactics. For example, a lot of people have written articles about the strength of France, and because of the strength of France, other powers need to be able to contain them, and weakening those powers can really be a huge mistake. That's one specific example.
Davide, that to follow up on that, you had mentioned earlier that in your Nexus tournament, at least to date, the players who are playing France and Germany, for example, have a big advantage.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? And are there particular powers that are at a tremendous disadvantage in gunboat, at least according to your current tournament?
I think that we can link to the previous question because I wouldn't say that there are wrong moves, but instead of full press, in which you have to discuss with words and then to move your units with the moves, in gunboat you have to discuss and to negotiate with moves. So sometimes you have to dedicate your moves not to tactic goals, but to negotiations. And sometimes you can have a wrong balance. In my experience as a player and as a spectator, I can see that sometimes a player spends his moves in supports that are useless, and then he risks to lose a game, or he has to go back to his attitude and to use more strength that communication. We have seen in our tournament that France and especially Germany because they are in the middle, especially Germany, of the board, so they can interact with everyone, and they can choose with the power to play with. We have seen that traditionally strong powers in full press like Turkey have a big disadvantage because they cannot build a common strategy with anyone.
I found that really fascinating because I've been in the diplomacy hobby a long time. I've been playing gunboat a long time, but back in the old days, England and Turkey were seen as by far the strongest gunboat countries because they're in the corner. That was one of the reasons that they were called the Wicked Witches of the East and the West in the diplomacy hobby. It was not just regular dip, but also in gunboat. So I find it fascinating that things appear to have changed. Brother Board, what do you think about that? What's your favorite and least favorite powers to play in gunboat?
So I think that in gunboat diplomacy, the lack of press increases the tactical abilities of France and Turkey. I'm not saying this isn't accounted for in the metagame, but those are powers that in press diplomacy are relatively easy to dig out compared to gunboat diplomacy. Because in order to overcome those powers' defenses, the players need to coordinate support attacks. 2 or 3 players need to support each other's moves in order to break down those defenses. And since those players cannot discuss in advance whose moves will be supported, it allows those powers to go on for a long time, even when there's a concentrated attack against them. And so even though I think those powers are really good on a defensive level, my preferred powers are actually Germany and Italy, because they are in the middle and you can influence a lot of things that happen in the match. I don't know that that Italy is necessarily the most powerful in gunboat diplomacy, but it sure is fun to move one army back and forth here and there and watch the other players squirm and react to it.
Well, that does sound like fun. Riaz, what kind of fun do you have with any particular power in gunboat?
I was going to mention the exact same powers as Brother Board. Germany and Italy are typically fun because people tend to give you a lot of space, especially as Italy. There's so much flexibility where you want to go. People tend to leave you alone and don't mind you growing because the tactical strength of France, as I've learned playing with some young players, is it's huge. And everybody needs an Italian player to be at least in France's face, and it gives them a lot of space, which is a lot of fun. And normally when I play face to face, I hate playing Italy because I get stuck at 4 forever. Germany's also a lot of fun just because once they get to the mid game, we all know how powerful that country can get to.
Sure. Well, it's time for our final gunboat thoughts. Starting with you, Davide, what parting thought do you have for our audience this evening?
No, I think in Nexus we are already preparing the new edition of the Gunboat Trophy, and it's very funny to see how many proposals, how many suggestions we are recording from our members. Because everyone is trying to fix what the issues of the tournament. We had five main issues about not only the weaker players that can influence the game or the civil disorder, but we have also the problem of powers that are very good to win a game and powers are very weak. I smile when I see that Russia is getting almost no point in comparison to full press, in which Russia is a very good nation. We have a problem to manage in allowing comments in general channels or prohibiting them, because we want the tournament to be participated, but we have to protect the balances of each single games. So I like very much how many proposals are coming from our members, and I think the second edition of our tournament will be very fun here.
Sounds great. Riaz, what about you? Final thoughts?
Gunboat really is a different game than FTF, but if you're looking for a way to be able to sharpen your tactical skills, for a way to have an opportunity to look at the other side of the board and follow that along, which you don't normally get in a face-to-face game, it's a great fit. It really is. But if you really want to do well with Gunboat, you have to play lots and you have to pay attention, because it is different, and we have talked about that.
All right. Well, last word goes to you, Brother Board. Tell our viewers what they need to know to dominate their next Gunboat board.
You must take into account the altered balance of power that exists during a gunboat game. I really like hearing that Russia had poor results confirms my opinion that Russia is, by a significant margin, the worst power in gunboat diplomacy. So bearing that in mind, don't attack Russia. Pick somebody else. Go after France early on. Go after Germany. Don't pick on poor Russia. You can take out Russia later on.
All right. Well, thanks, fellas. I appreciate this discussion. It was really great, and we'll see you around. And thanks to all of you watching at home. We hope you have enjoyed this broadcast of Deadline. If you have news, ideas for features, or feedback of any kind, please feel free to send an email to info@diplobn.com, or you can drop me a line directly using davidhood@dixiecon.com. For other broadcast offerings, visit our website at diplobn.com. This is David Hood signing off. I wish you brightness and bliss and, of course, Belgium.